Hello everyone, this is the stream number 2 about us building a custom web application in Webflow. We're using the PokéAPI that essentially returns data from Pokémons, and we are building our own custom application that interacts with that API. And I don't know, we'll try to come up with cool features during these streams where we end up with a cool application that it's fun. Maybe we can check information about Pokemons. Maybe we can create battles, Pokemon battles. Maybe we can favorite stuff. We'll see.
That's effing sweet.
If you recall, what we did on the last stream was we cloned the developer starter template, okay? And with that, we essentially built this bit of code in here that grabs an item template. And then from that item template, it populates a bunch of new items. We call them Pokemon items. And from the data that at this moment, the data is coming from a hard-coded set of data inside the code base. We're pulling that data, we're adding it to the template, and then we're populating the elements in here. Okay? I think that the first thing that we should do today is move away from having the set of data that it's hard-coded here in the code base. I want to get rid of this Pokemon's data variable, and instead, I want to start consuming the API from the PokéAPI. Let me just open again in here. So if I visit this, go and we visit it, essentially we get a bunch of results, okay? And each one of the results just returns two fields. That is the name of the Pokemon and a URL to the data set of that Pokemon. That's gonna be important. Okay. And then from that Pokemon, we can retrieve anything that we want. We can retrieve abilities, we can retrieve forms. Game indices, probably we don't need it, but the moves that it has, the name, the order, sprites in case that we want to get pictures from it. And I think we can get stats also, types, and the weight. So I think that today we can grab this information and display it in Webflow. Okay, so let's start. First of all, let's delete this Pokemon's data. Okay, I want to get rid of this. And the first thing that we have to do is see how we fetch this data from the API. If we check the Pokemon API documentation, it already mentions that we have a couple of query params that we can pass to it. Okay, we have the base of, let me zoom in a little bit more. We have the base of the API, which is pokeapi.com/API/v2. And the endpoint that we want to hit is the Pokemon endpoint. Yep. And additionally, we can pass the limit and the offset. Okay, these two query params are going to determine the Pokemons that are being returned from these endpoints. Okay, the limit is essentially just the limit. So I can say that I just want to grab 5 Pokemons, and then we just get 5 Pokemon. And the offset essentially defines the point where we should start retrieving Pokemon. So imagine that on the first call, we retrieve 5 Pokemons, right? Then on a second call, maybe because I'm using pagination or something like that, I want to retrieve 5 more Pokemons. So I have to start from the Pokemon number 6, because from 1 to 5, I already got them. I have to start number 6. So I would do it with the offset, and I would say, hey, give me an offset of 6, and now you can see that the results are different. But if I do an offset of 2, for example, then it starts at Venusaur. And now let me remove the offset. You can see that Venusaur is the third one, because we're offsetting two of them. Does that make sense? So let's start with this. Let me create a new function. Okay, instead of just having everything in here, let's try to stay organized, because ideally this project is going to grow quite a lot during all the streams that we'll do. Maybe we can start by even extracting what we created. I think that we should do it. Maybe, okay, let's create the fetching function first, and then we'll refactor what we have so far. Okay, so let me create a new function, and we can just say, get rid of Copilot. I don't want to have spoilers. Let's say fetch Pokemon. Okay, and this function is going to hit the API. Okay, first thing that we have to do is hit the endpoint. So JavaScript already has the fetch API that it's called, and it's essentially a way of retrieving it's a resource that is external. Okay, but fetch, if we do this, let me grab this. Let's start with a limit of 5 Pokemons. Okay, so for now, I'll just hardcode this. Okay, if I do this, now there are a couple things that are missing here. Okay, the first one is that when I'm using fetch, the fetch function, it's not returning the data right away. It's returning a promise with a response. Okay, if we just hover over it, you will see that the return, it's a promise, and the promise resolve value, it's a response. Okay, this means that essentially this function, it's asynchronous. It doesn't happen right away. It's not blocking the page. It's doing some task that it's going to take a while. It can take, 10 milliseconds. It can take 2 seconds. We don't know. So we have to kind of let the browser know, hey, I want to wait until this action finishes, right? There are 2 ways of doing that. The first one is just chaining, using the promise, and then chaining a new method here called then, like this. And this then accepts a callback with a response. Okay? This is something that we could do. But it's not ideal when you have long bits of code, because essentially you start nesting stuff inside one inside the other. Okay, so instead of doing chain then, which forces us to pass callbacks into it, we're gonna do a better method that it's just awaiting. Okay, and I think that this should address some of the questions that people had in other streams about async await, stuff like that. Okay, when you pass the await keyword, you're essentially just telling the browser, hey, anything that runs in here after this line of code, do not run it until this specific action finishes. Okay, we need to wait until this finishes. And now if I hover in the over the response variable, you will see that now it's a response, not a promise. Let me do it again. If I do this, this is a promise. If I have the await, this is a response. Okay, a promise is essentially defining what I mentioned, that it's a value, but that it's not still there. We have to wait until that comes. Yep. So response. Cool. Let me grab this and I'll open the console like this. And I think that we can start by calling it in here just for the sake of Pokemons like this. So now we're running just this. So response contains a bunch of information. Okay? And first of all, we can check if the request was successful. Okay? A response contains what's called the HTTP status. Let me just have this status says like this. An HTTP status, it's essentially a code that defines how was the response, how did the request go? Like, did it go correctly? Like everything went as expected, or was something that did not go as expected? And let me show you a bunch of them. So the 200 just defines that it's okay. Okay, 200 means all good. The request was successful. The response was also successful. Everything was good. Okay. The other one that you probably already know, it's the 404. This one is the most known, right? And it's not found. Okay. But there's a reason why it's 404 not found. It's because this code represents the server telling us, hey, we cannot find what you're trying to look for. Okay, so this is one error that you could potentially get, right? But there are other errors that you could also get. For example, if we get a 400, the server it's not able to process what we sent to it. Like something that you sent along, it's not processable by the server. If you get a 401, it means that you don't have permissions to get it. Like imagine that, for example, I'm trying to fetch some resources that belong to a user and I'm not logged in. So this means that I have no permissions to fetch for that content, right? So the server is telling me that. It's telling me, hey, you don't have permissions. Or, we can check a bunch of them, payment required, not found, forbidden, method not allowed, etc. Okay? This response object is actually a very crucial piece of information that we get from the server. It's still not the data, so it's still not the Pokemon data that we're looking for, but it's something that we can use to determine if everything went correctly, right? So the first thing that we could do is, in this response, if the response was not successful, it means that we're not getting the Pokemons back, right? And we can either do it by checking if the status was 200, or there's a convenient property that's called OK. And this OK, essentially, it's true whenever the status is 200. Or maybe I think that any range of the two, 200, 201, I believe so. But I'm not, don't mark my words here because I'm not sure. But I know that if we get an OK, it means that the response contains the data that we're expecting. Okay? So we could start by saying if the response was not OK, negate this. Okay. Here we can do something. Okay. When this happens, it means that we did not get the Pokemons back. Okay. So either we could just, for example, return something different like null, or in this case, because I'm a little bit lazy and I don't want to handle everything, I will just return an empty array. Okay. So this means that if the response is successful, then we'll return an array that contains all the Pokemons. But if this response is not successful, we're still going to return an array, okay? But it's going to be empty. Okay, cool. And now we have to grab the data from the response, right? So the response contains the body, okay? But the body is actually what contains the Pokemon data in this case. But the body does not come as a string. It does not come as something that we can read right away. It comes as a readable stream. Okay, this is just the format of the data and how it's coming in response. What we have to do is now convert this body to the data format that we want to use. Okay. Usually people just think about doing something like response.json. Okay, and because we're saying, hey, convert the body to JSON, this essentially is going to return the data as JSON. Check. Okay, cool. Oh, by the way, that's wrong because I'm returning an empty array, but it should be this. Well, we'll see. Okay, that's fine. So this data now it's converted to JSON, but you can actually convert the body to many other formats. Okay, imagine that instead of getting JSON, I want to get it as just a string. I can do that. I can just say, hey, return me the body as text. Now, if I console log the data, now it's just returning as a string, And this, for example, is helpful when you're fetching HTML pages. Maybe you're fetching an external XML page and you want to, then convert that HTML to something else. You want to get it first as a string, because JSON, it's not valid HTML. So just be aware that, doing the await fetch and then response, JSON, stuff like that, it's usually how it's done, but it's not the only way that you can do stuff. Okay. And by the way, for all the people who did not come on the last stream, I've just decided to go slowly when building stuff, and instead during along while we're building, I'm just gonna try to, teach tips and stuff that I think are cool to learn. Usually when you're fetching stuff, what you will see is people just slapping a try catch like that. okay? And then maybe you console log the error when something goes wrong, and then also you return an array, okay? And usually you just see this, like this, and you return the data. This is not wrong, okay? But this is actually not covering all the different cases that could happen. That's why I wanted to show you first how to handle a bad response. So imagine, for example, that this response comes as with a status of 404. Okay? Just imagine that this response comes with a 404. It means that the response is probably not going to have a body because, the resource that you're trying to fetch, it's not there, right? So you're essentially just leaving this bit to fail. Because then when you call response, not text, but JSON, when you call response.json, this is actually going to fail, right? And then it's why the try catch, it's going to come into place, and the error that is generated when trying to call the data, and then it's going to be catched here, and then you can do something, right? But this means that you actually don't have any way of knowing what exactly failed, right? Because it could be that the response wasn't 404, okay? But it could also be that the response was the response status was a 401, which means that it's unauthorized, okay? Which means that what I was missing is, for example, sending an access token or something like that. Yeah, it's pretty a rabbit hole. It's a rabbit hole when you start going down. But I think that people should know that the try catch, it's not the ultimate solution. It's just a way of handling errors in a global way. That something fails, then just catch it. But you don't actually know exactly what failed, right? So I think that if you want it to be like very, very following the best practices, you should always try to handle potential cases that you expect that could happen. Like the response was not okay. Because when the response was not okay, it means that it doesn't make sense at all to try to convert the response to JSON data. Instead, you could do something like that, or you could throw a custom error. You could say throw no error, and then here you could say the response failed like this. And now, let me just do it when the response is okay, so we can simulate it happening. But now you can see that I get my own custom error, and then I can, identify faster what went wrong, or maybe I can take some actions. Like imagine that. So the response failed, but imagine that the response was a 401. Okay, so imagine that a response status equals to 401, like this. This means that the user was not authorized, right? So for example, in here, I could say throw a new error, and it's not going to be an error. It's going to be a custom error that I created. Maybe it's an auth error. Okay. This does not exist. We could create it, but I'm not going to do that. And now, then when I get the error here, I could check, like, for example, if the error, it's an instance of the auth error that does not exist. That's why I'm getting these all these squiggly lines in here. But then maybe I could do some action like notify the user to please log in. Maybe here I could just say, tell user to please log in, and this is a function. So it allows you to better handle every single potential case that could happen. Okay. So now that we know this, and for the people who are not into coding, I'm sorry if I'm confusing the hell out of you, but I think it's something important to know. Now that we know all of this, let's just return to what we wanted to do. Okay, so in here, I'm actually doing something wrong. I'll just go, just for the sake of simplifying stuff, I'll leave it like that. I'm actually doing something wrong here. I'm returning some data when it goes okay, but I'm returning an array when it fails. Okay, and let me show you. Oops, let me console log the data. Log the data. Okay, this is the data that we're getting. Okay, if the request was successful, we're returning this data, but when something fails, we're returning an array. So that's something that it's missing here. We're actually returning two types of data, and we're expecting just to get the same data, you know? So there's something that we should do to fix this. Now, it's a little bit hard to know in the code base what you're working with if you don't have type definitions, right? This data right now, it just set it as any. It could be anything because the browser, the VS Code doesn't know what data we're getting from the Pokémon API. So we have to get proper typings. Okay, I could create the types myself. I could come here and say, type Pokemon's response equals to blah blah blah, and I could type everything. But I'm pretty lazy. So what I'm gonna do instead, I'm gonna use something that's called QuickType. And if you don't know about this, it's a time saver. It's a lifesaver. QuickType essentially allows me to grab a set of data. Let me look again. I'll just copy this object, okay, and I'll paste it in here, like this. And now I'm getting automatic type definitions for the set of data that I added here. This is a huge time saving, especially if the API it's giganormous. Yes. What? Yeah. So now, instead of having to manually type everything, I can just, and I don't want to call this configuration, I'm going to call it Pokemon's response, like this. And now I can just put it here. No need to export. No need to export. And now I can just define this set of data as a Pokemon response. So now we define the data as Pokemon's response, right? Which means that I can now identify what I want to return from this fetch Pokemon's function. Okay, I just want to return the results, right? Because I want in here, when something fails, I want to return an array of the results. And when something is also correct, I also want to return an array of results. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define here, just for now, that this returns a promise. Imagine that this result was like this. Okay, imagine that these results, actually, let me just put it as this. These results interface, I just have one Pokemon's response. And I want to define the return of this function to be the results. Pokemon's response dot results. Okay, something is missing here. So in TypeScript, you can always access any nested property if you use an accessor, like with brackets. Okay, so for example, imagine that now I want to determine, I don't know, like result. Now I could say Pokemon's response, results, and I could even say, get me one, and now this is going to be returning result, Now that we've defined the function to return what we wanted to get, now I'm getting an error, and that's correct. I'm getting an error because now TypeScript knows that we are expecting to return just the results, but instead we're returning the entire response data. Okay, so now to fix this, I have to define the results. No more errors. And if we do come here and let's say Pokemon's equals to weight. And by the way, if you want to use a weight, you have to always define a function as async, like this. So we have the Pokemons. Let's console log the Pokemons like this. Now we get an array. Okay, we just get the array, which is what we care for. We just wanted to get the Pokemons. That's good. There's a couple more things that I want to do, but first of all, I think we should now get rid of this Pokemon's data variable that we have here. Remember that this Pokemon's data, it's a hard-coded variable that contains a bunch of Pokemons. But we have a problem here, because so far we fetched the Pokemons, but we haven't gotten the right information yet. Let's inspect again the response here. What we got from the Pokemon's data, it's just the name and the URL, okay? And this URL is the one that actually holds the data of that Pokemon, like this, okay? Which means that we need to do an extra request here. We cannot just use the data that came from the Pokemon's, this initial Pokemon's request, okay? So here in Fetch Pokemons, we have to do an extra step. So for now, let me call this Fetch Pokemon list, okay, because it returns the list of Pokemon. So instead of returning the results from this, I want to now convert these results into the Pokemon's data, right? We have an array here. So what we can do is grab the results and map them, okay? Because each one of the results, it's containing already a URL. And when I map them, I can again do another fetch with the URL, okay? I could just do that, but let's also make it proper like this. So this means that it has to be async, right? This function. Now we get the response, and the response we have to get the data from it. So response.json, we need to wait for it. And again, I'm gonna do the same exact trick. I'm gonna go grab some Pokemon data. I'll just grab it entirely. And I'll put it in here, and this is gonna be Pokemon data. And I'll just put it here, like this. And voila, we got type definitions for a Pokemon. So this is cool. And instead, I think I'm just gonna move everything to a types folder, because it's gonna be very convoluted instead. If I have everything in a single file. So I just want to export. Actually, let me remove all exports, and I'll just keep the Pokemon data. And I'll do the same for the Pokemon's response. I'll take this and I'll put it in the types file. And this Pokemon's response comes from the types folder, this file. And now I can define this data as Pokemon data. Okay. The only thing that I've done is I've taken all the type definitions and I've moved them to a separate file to keep things organized. So Pokemon data. The data that we're getting here, it's Pokemon data. Okay. So now this data, TypeScript knows about everything. You know, the abilities, forms, experience, ID, height, moves. We got everything. I have a question from Emily. I'll answer it in a second. So now I'm gonna return the data like this. But one extra thing. Again, this could potentially fail, right? I could, for example, check if the response failed, but for the sake of keeping things simple, I'm just gonna do a try catch here. Error. If the request it's successful, we're gonna return the data. But if something fails, we cannot return the data, right? So I'm gonna return null in this case. And bear with me. We're gonna return null because after we've done all of the fetch requests, we can just pick the ones that failed, that return null, and just discard them. We can remove them from the array. Okay, and that's what I'm gonna do. So far, we've got the response, we've got the data, and now we are looping through all the results of the data. Let's remember that the results are just a name and a URL. And now I'm individually fetching the data from each of the URLs, from Bulbasaur, Ivysaur, Venusaur, etc. Okay, and that data also could fail. Okay, so now let me just say Pokemon's data equals to this. Cool. Now I have a problem. Look what I got here. I've got a promise of an array of promises, that can be either Pokemon data or null. But I don't want an array of promises, right? I just want the Pokemon data or null, but I don't want the promises. So first thing that you would think is, okay, what happens if I do an await, right? Because when we have here the fetch that it's returning a promise, I just awaited it, and that's it. And now the response is it's no longer a promise. But if I will await this, look what happens. It's still the same. I'm still getting a promise, an array of promises. When we await a single variable, then the VS Code, the JavaScript knows that we're just waiting for that specific variable. But when we are mapping through an array of variables, you've got the promises inside inside the array. So each promise, it's a slot in the array, right? So waiting for the entire array doesn't make any sense, right? What we have to do is use something called promise all, or actually no, Chabi, you were wrong. I thought that you wrote promise all. Promise resolve, it's not the correct answer. It's promise all. Okay, because this promise all, it's a function that accepts an array. Okay, inside promise all, I can pass an array. In this case, the array, it's the results that we've mapped that contains all the promises. And now, again, I'm just getting a single promise, not an entire an array of promises. I'm just getting a single promise that contains the results. And this means that I can await this. And now the Pokemon's data that I'm getting, it's an array of Pokemon data or null. Okay, this method essentially it's saying, hey, take all the slots from this array, take all the items from this array, and just give me a single promise that will resolve when all the promises inside the array resolve. So last thing, now we've got an array of Pokemon data or null, right? Because we could potentially have a failed response. So the last thing to do is I want to filter for any value that it's not correct. Okay. How would you do that? There's a cool way of doing it. Did you know that you can just do this? I need to wrap this like that. When you're filtering, you can just pass the Boolean constructor here. So we've got an array, but it contains either Pokemon data or null values. The last thing to do is I want to get rid of all the null values from it. What I could do is I could say filter and check for the data and make sure that the data exists. So if I just did this, because filter is expecting a truthy value, it means that the data has to be truthy. Null, it's falsy, meaning that if I just return data, the filter will already know if something it's not correct and filter it out. Okay, I could, for example, also say when data it's not null. It's the same, okay? But there's a simpler way of doing something, and it's just passing Boolean, like this. And Boolean, because the constructor Boolean, it's a function that you can pass anything. I could pass the object of data and returns a Boolean. So it's essentially just doing this, as doing data, like this. So this, it's the same as doing this. So it's convenient for filtering. But actually, I'm going to have a problem because Pokemon's data, it's going to be filtered, but TypeScript doesn't know about it. I don't know why, but TypeScript doesn't know that when you filter something using Boolean, it doesn't work correctly, okay? But if you have TS-utils, there is a helper method called isNotEmpty that is just a function that wraps the Boolean state. It's the same exact thing, but gives you then proper type definitions, okay? This specific thing that I just shared, it's pretty advanced, so don't worry. You could totally just go and use filter as I mentioned before. But it's a cool little tip to know that we have a helper called isNotEmpty that it's gonna filter out any type that it's falsy using TypeScript. Okay, Pokemon's data. Now I want to return the Pokemon's data, and this means that instead in here we want to return Pokemon data as an array, like this. Okay. Now if we check the response, instead of getting only the list with the name and URLs, we've actually converted that list to a list of the full Pokemon data with abilities, forms, IDs, everything. Everything is included here. Okay. This means that now we can get rid of this Pokemon's data, and instead I'll just call Pokemon's data like this. And maybe actually we could rename these to fetch Pokemon's data. I think it's fine. Okay. So look at this. Now, okay, we have Bulbasaur, Ivysaur, Venusaur with the proper images, with the proper names, with the proper information. Okay. And we could now change, for example, sprites. This could be undefined. Okay, I'll address this in a second. But this means that instead of fetching the first 5 Pokemons, maybe I want to fetch the first from 20 to 25, for example, or from 21 to 25, to be more exact. So I could now add an offset of 20. And this means that we should get other Pokemons, or an offset of 100. And more Pokemons, yay. Or an offset of 50. More Pokemons, cool. Okay, there's one last thing, and it's that here I'm getting a potential error of this being undefined. So sprites, okay, this is essentially because other could potentially be undefined. It's it? Can it be undefined? Sprites, other. Well, I'm gonna assume that it could be undefined. So we can set a fallback just in case that this fails. So let's just grab a fallback. Let me visit 1 second. Sprites. So if other does not exist, which is weird, but apparently could happen, then let's just grab the front default, for example. And I'll just mention that whenever this other does not exist, I want to have the sprites.front default. Okay, so essentially I'm just saying, hey, try to get this from the SVG, from nested property of other dream world from default. But if for any reason it does not exist, then just fall back to the front default. Okay, I think that should not affect at all, but yeah, we'll just okay, everything works. So right now we are hard coding the URL that we use to fetch the Pokemon. Have this, and then in the URL, we're passing the limit and we are passing the offset, right? But, I want this to be a little bit more easy to just consume this function. I mean, whenever I want to get something else, So I want to make these parameters dynamic. So obviously we can just create new arguments for the function. New parameters, and I could say the limit, it could be optional, No, actually, let's make it mandatory. The limit, it would be a number. Okay, remember that we're using TypeScript, so we have to define the types of what we expect. And then the offset will also be a number. Okay. Now, probably the first thing that many people would do, and in this particular case, it's completely valid. Okay, but it's not the best practice when dealing with URLs. Most people, what we do is just come here in limit and just create a template string, and then substitute this for the variable, like this. Okay. Can somebody tell me why this could potentially be a bad practice? Because in this particular case, we're just dealing with numbers, so it's fine. But imagine that it could be a string that we could pass, like, I don't know, a message or a name, whatever. Let me just show you something. I know it's a little bit small, but I'm gonna type in the URL bar, and I'm just gonna create a new query param. Let's call it test equals, and now I'm gonna just write a message. This is a custom cool message that uses, and let's just use a bunch of random stuff like this. Okay, so it's a small. Let me just copy and paste it before I visit it. But what I've written is this. Look, well, you can actually already see what happened. Look how the browser already converted this piece of string. Maybe if I copy it again. Yeah. How the browser converted this piece of string to this. Okay. This is because the query params are expected to be encoded. You cannot just send this to a server. You have to encode it. So it's a valid URL string. Okay, the browser already does it for us when we type in the URL bar. So when we are here and we type anything, if I visit it, you can see how the browser already converts it. But when you're doing it yourself, when you are just taking a string and you're writing it yourself, and then you're fetching, the browser is actually not converting this for you. So it means that you have to encode it, right? So then some people would try to just go and say, okay, then I'm gonna encode it. Code URI component like this, try to encode everything so it's properly formatted. But there's a better way of doing this. And I don't see enough people doing it because it's just super powerful. So in JavaScript, we have a built-in method for creating URL objects. And I can say new URL. Okay, this is a built-in class that JavaScript has. And in this new URL, I could just pass the base URL. Okay, this now, if I console log this, let me just show you. This now has all the information about the URL. It has the host name, the full href, the origin, the path name, the protocol. It has everything. But also, it has something called URL search params. Okay, and this search params, it's really helpful. This URL, now I can mutate it however I want. Okay, if I do this, if I do console log URL, and now I say URL path name equals to blah, and again I do a console log of URL, you can see how the URL object is updated with whatever I change. So now the href, instead of being Pokémon, it's blah, like this. With search params, I can do the same. I can come here and I can say URL.search params. And I have a bunch of methods in here. And one of the methods is append. Okay? This search params append, I can pass a parameter with any kind of format, and it's automatically going to encode it for me. So I can say limit, and I can pass the limit. Okay? I believe that it has to be a string. Yeah, so I will have to do the string like this. And I can also say the offset. Okay, and now if I console log the URL, see how the href contains the proper query params. But I could say test, and I could say this is my custom blah 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 blah. And if I check this is already being encoded. So the URL, it's automatically gonna handle anything that I pass into it, and it's gonna properly encode it. It's gonna prepare it so browsers and servers can consume it correctly. Yeah, it's really useful. It's really useful. So now I can just say, hey, when fetching, instead of fetching this hard-coded URL, just fetch from the URL object. Because you can pass to the fetch function, you can pass either a string or you can pass a URL object. So now when we fetch, everything still works fine, but we don't have to worry about encoding. And this is the last thing that I wanted to teach you today before wrapping up the stream. Cool. So this is the end of today's stream. We've finally hooked the data of the Pokémons from the PokéAPI. So now instead of having hard-coded the data in the codebase, we're getting it properly from an external source and showing it here in the project. Next stream, I'm gonna go one step further and I'm gonna create the pages where you can visit each one of these individual Pokemons and you can see all the stats. So if you want to see that, stay tuned. We'll see you in the next Friday. Thank you for being here.